Welcome to Musing Heavy, the site devoted to alternative reflections on hard rock and heavy metal. Stephen Meyer here. Part 2 of a series entitled Metal Mindfulness, Enhancing Mental Health with Heavy Music. And so what we're going to do in this particular episode is we're really going to get into the nuts and bolts of this connection. In my belief that heavy metal music can be used as a great tool for achieving mindfulness, staying in the present, and as I talked about in part 1 of this series, this is our most healthiest state. When we're not dwelling on the past and worrying about the future, we're at our best when we're in the present. And I believe heavy metal music can be a great tool for helping us achieve that. Okay, so let's dig in. And so as always, you can check the links below if you want to just read the essay and not listen to me talk about it. So that's always an option. Okay. Complex and new metal, food for thought. Heavy metal was made for mindfulness practice. I truly believe that. Even though there's probably not any other source that's going to tell you that, I have come to that conclusion anyway. I'm convinced that metal at its best is highly thought-provoking and sophisticated. And I say this with an enthusiasm that would echo someone else's admiration for, say, jazz and classical. Even if too many of the uninitiated, those not familiar with heavy metal, say, assume that it all sounds like Motley Crue. Now, I'm not beating Motley Crue up. I actually like their first couple albums, but really, they have nothing to do with, say, complex heavy metal. In fact, they're hardly metal at all, right? Indeed, many artists existing in metal's more extreme subgenres, say in death metal, black metal, and especially prog metal, write and perform songs that even veteran fans of this type of music are not going to fully comprehend or digest upon the first few listens, right? If you want to properly decode albums by Immolation, a great death metal band, Enslaved, a black metal band, or Dream Theater, a prog metal band, to name just a few of a million examples I could give you, it's going to take some effort. And that's perfect for achieving mindfulness and keeping you in that healthy state of presence, because you got to think about it. You got to work at it, right? So nothing could be more appropriate for active, mindful listening. Few, if any, will truly get complex metal if it's only on for background, right? Or if you just let your mind drift while listening. Hey, that's fine. I'm not saying you should never do that. Just have music on to chill and my mind goes where it wants. But when you want to use heavy metal to achieve mindfulness and to stay present, you want to be focused. And certain types of heavy metal are absolutely ideal for that. Because one needs to be present with the riffs, with the rhythm arrangements, with the vocal lines, with the lead guitars, and on it goes to fully appreciate what's happening. And depending on a person's rate of assimilation, how quickly it takes you to learn an album, this could take several listens, several iterations. Okay? So, as a case in point, as a great example, my experience with Iron Maiden's latest opus, Senjutsu, which was released last year, may be instructive. But first, just a little bit of background on Maiden, etc. I won't go too deep into this because lots of people know about Iron Maiden. I've talked about them before. But in many ways, Iron Maiden is the most important metal group to come out of the new wave of British heavy metal movement that occurred in the 70s and 80s. And this particular movement is really, really important, right? Not only did it foster a bunch of great bands, countless great bands that came out of that movement, it was a key bridge. The new wave of British heavy metal was the bridge between sort of traditional proto-metal, right, as played by greats like Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, Budgie, and others, right, and the link then to some of the more extreme subgenres that came later, thrash metal, death metal, black metal, and on it goes, that became popular in the 80s and 90s. So the new wave of British heavy metal is that crucial sort of bridge, right? That being said, and I believe Iron Maiden was probably the most important band to come out of that. That being said, though, the majority of Iron Maiden's esteemed catalog is as much progressive rock, which actually reaches back to the 60s and 70s, as it is heavy metal, making them, Iron Maiden, perhaps the key forerunners, along with the Mighty Rush, of this prog metal subgenre. And like Rush, Maiden is really beyond criticism in terms of musicianship, integrity, and an uncanny ability to consistently write and perform complex songs that are actually still very accessible. Now, that's really important for mindfulness, because this makes Iron Maiden or their style of metal an ideal choice for staying present, or for using music to help you achieve mindfulness. Because their work is complicated, right? So it challenges you. It keeps your mind active because of that. But it's not so far left field as to become incomprehensible to all but the most specialized of observers. I love Enslaved, right? Enslaved challenges me to no end. It keeps my mind active, keeps me present when I'm trying to figure out what Enslaved's doing. But I realize for a lot of people, they're way too weird, way too left field. They're just not accessible that it's going to work for most people. Whereas Maiden, incredibly complex, incredibly sophisticated, but still quite accessible, right? So they're kind of the sweet spot for a lot of people if you want to use metal to achieve mindfulness and keep us healthy in the present, which should always be a goal as often as we can do it. Okay, but my goal in this particular section is to demonstrate how becoming familiar with Maiden Senjutsu can help one stay present and contribute to an ongoing practice of active listening, right? I chose this album for this particular presentation because I personally have not played it to the point of saturation, which I believe is really important in achieving maximum mindful benefits. An album you know super, super well, ultimately it's hard to challenge you, right? It's best to pick an album that's, yes, complex. For some, you want it still to be accessible, but also one that you haven't played out yet, that you're still hearing new things with it, right? And that's why, for me at least, at the point where I am with Senjutsu, it's a great choice for using it to practice mindfulness. And again, just for a little bit of background, what I mean by that, let's look at Iron Maiden's catalog real quick. And what I've done is I've broken it up into sections based on, for me personally, and this could be similar for other people out there too, where I am in terms of how much I've assimilated the music. So for me, the first 7 Iron Maiden albums, as amazing as they are, and I still enjoy listening to them this day, and they're always a rush for me, right? But I'm pretty much fully assimilated to the point of saturation with Iron Maiden, Killers, The Number of the Beast, Peace of Mind, Power Slave, Somewhere in Time, and Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. What I mean, it's not that I don't enjoy listening to them, I do. But when I do play them nowadays, I'm not learning that much more because I know the album so well. And why would that be? And again, this is probably similar to other longtime Maiden fans. I've just lived with these albums for so long. I was an Iron Maiden fan from day one. I bought the new release in 1980, right away, and I've bought every album as soon as it came out. So I've just listened to these albums so much over time. Compared to the rest of their discography, I've just had the opportunity to live with them so much longer. The other factor too, at least for me, I'm the type of music fan where I tend to accumulate. In other words, I don't grow out of things, right? It's not like I used to be into that and I never listened to it again. Once I like something, I tend to always like it, right? So for me, as my record collection grows, I just get into more and more stuff. So any particular album, as time goes on, just has more competition for my ears, so to speak, right? So when I was first listening to Iron Maiden, oh yeah, I was into all kinds of other metal bands, but not like it is today. Right? Today, it's hard for me to spend a lot of time with anything because there's just so much more I'm listening to, right? So these early Maiden albums, not only have I lived with them the longest, they didn't have quite as much competition for my ear as things have become as time goes on. So consequently, I just know these albums super well. As great as they are, they would not be my first choice for using these albums to achieve mindfulness, to keep me in the present, to make my mind active, to challenge me, because I just know them too well. Okay, that's sort of what I'm saying here. And I guess I would say the same thing for this next group of albums. I don't know them quite as well as the first 7, but they're mostly assimilated for me, and they're still really well known. So No Prayer for the Dying, Fear of the Dark, The X Factor, and The Virtual 11, right? I know those really well. So again, better choices for mindfulness, because there's still a couple things I'm learning, but probably not the best choices. Here are the best choices. Again, not that I never want to play the old stuff, because I do, but if what I want to use it to practice mindfulness, here's what I'm going to gravitate towards if I want to hear Maiden. It'll be really every album, any album that's been put out since 2000, because when it comes to Brave New World, Dance of Death, A Matter of Life or Death, and The Final Frontier, I've only partially assimilated these albums. There's still a lot to learn for me. Every time I play, say, Dance of Death, I'm still hearing new things. I'm still challenged, right? That's perfect. That's keeping my mind active as I'm going through those albums, right? It's making me learn more stuff. That's what we want for mindfulness. Keep us in the moment. I'm not, dwelling on the past or worrying about the future. My mind's not wandering. I'm totally engaged, or that's what I try to achieve, right? And even better would be the most recent albums, because I don't know those albums, super well yet. I'm still learning them, right? So the Book of Souls and Senjutsu, especially because it's the most recent, I haven't really assimilated these a lot yet at all. There's much to learn. So I've picked Senjutsu for this particular presentation to demonstrate how this album can really help keep me in the present if I'm really focused on it, and that's the key. All right, so let's look at this in a little more detail. All right, so as I said, this process again of keeping my mind active when I'm dwelling on an album to help me practice mindfulness, to keep me at that healthy spot of being in the present and not worrying about the future or the past, right? I think this has two fairly distinct levels when you're using metal to achieve this. I'll call these analytical active listening and non-judgmental active listening. All right, let's look at both. So in terms of analytical active listening, when I hear a piece of music for the first time, and then subsequently I play the album fairly frequently in the short term, it's inevitable that part of my learning process, part of my active mind when I'm focusing on the music, will be to analyze and compare it, okay? In the case of well-established artists such as Iron Maiden, longtime fans are likely to contrast, say, any new release like Senjutsu with previous albums, right? When you're analyzing it, inevitably you're going to compare to stuff they've done before. But if you're somebody who's new to Maiden, for example, you'll likely compare their songs to other metal bands who are in prog metal, perhaps, or just heavy metal in general. Either will work. Either ways works, right? So what's my experience with Senjutsu? When I'm listening to Senjutsu and when I'm trying to compare and analyze it, keeping my mind active and in the present, real healthy, that's good, right? What are some of the things I'm comparing? What am I analyzing? Just to give you just a little sample here. While in broad terms, I do hear Senjutsu as a unique work within prog metal, some sections, certainly though, of this album recall other Maiden classics that I've enjoyed for decades, right? So my analytical comparisons going on there. For instance, certain songs off Senjutsu, such as Stratego, Death of the Celts, and The Parchment, 3 great songs, by the way, connect me to albums of the past by Iron Maiden, especially Power Slave. I hear some Power Slave in those songs. I hear some of the X Factor, first album of Blaze Bayley. I hear some X Factor from 95. Whereas other songs off Senjutsu, for example, The Writing on the Wall, especially, and even the title track, I hear those as real departures. I don't think Maiden's ever really put out songs quite like those before. So they feel really new and fresh in a lot of ways, right? Other sort of comparisons, other analytical things going on in my mind. With Senjutsu, it's clear that Maiden have not forsaken their proclivity for long, sprawling epics. There's a lot of songs on Senjutsu that are well over the 7-8 minute mark. Lots of things going on in these songs, right? So Maiden are still squarely in that prog metal sort of way of thinking. But I find that the transitional twists and turns in the music are smoother than in the past, right? So again, we still got these long epics. Sometimes they build, sometimes they get really fast, they slow down, they get dreary, they get sort of gallopy, all those Maiden trademarks. But it just feels like as they switch tempos and moods, the transitions feel smoother. It's like the edges have coming off, right? On Senjutsu compared to previous ones. So when I'm listening to it, that's my active mind is thinking about these things. Keep me in the present. I'm not worrying about other stuff, right? So that's healthy, right? Other examples, as is customary with this band, production continues to favor low-end frequencies. Yet, the at times intense presence of Steve Harris's bass guitar, I think it's tempered on Senjutsu a little bit. His tone is more integrated in the mix, and that's sort of the flavor I get from Senjutsu. Things are smoother. Things are more integrated, right? In the past, Steve Harris's bass, which is always a joy to listen to, felt like sometimes it was almost overpowering. In Senjutsu, it just sits back real nicely in the mix, it feels to me. Same with the keyboards. Now, keyboards have never been a big deal in Iron Maiden, right? But they've often been used for mood or to embellish some of the chords, stuff like that, right? There were times on past Maiden albums, I thought the keyboards were a little intrusive. They kind of almost didn't fit. On Senjutsu, they fit beautifully. Again, this integration, the roundness of it, the smoothness of it, which in comparison to other albums, right? Another example I could give, and again, in terms of the analytical mind working here, I continue to be impressed with the vocal range demonstrated by Bruce Dickinson, who of course is an absolute metal star, one of the greatest ever in metal, in spite of some reports bemoaning some loss in his upper register. I remember when Senjutsu first came out, and I read lots of reports and reviews of the album, etc. Lots of people are saying, Bruce lost some range. I can't hit the high notes quite the same, you know. And when I'm listening to Senjutsu, honestly, I don't hear that. He sounds as great as ever. His range just sounds as killer. He's absolutely nailing it. So I'm just not hearing that. So again, another sort of analytical thing. I'm remembering those reports, and when I'm hearing them, going, boy, Bruce still sounds like the king to me, you know. Anyway, that's how I'm hearing it, right? So anyway, there are several other analytical observations I could state. The central point is that this type of analysis keeps my mind active and grounded in the now. Super healthy place to be, right? Metal as a tool for mindfulness, okay? So connecting this just even a little more. Those looking to avoid or supplement pharmaceuticals when dealing, say, with anxiety or depression issues will inevitably attempt mindfulness approaches such as breathing techniques and the like. So meditating, just concentrating on your breath, great stuff, great techniques, awesome. Also common is employing mindfulness in everyday activities such as walking, in which one brings awareness to every stride and takes deliberate notice of the surroundings when you're moving. So when you're going for a walk, you're just not, your mind's not on autopilot. You're just not thinking about everything. You're thinking about what you're doing. You're thinking about every step. You're noticing the snow in front of your shoe, right? You're noticing the trees. You're noticing the air, all those things, right? Again, you're active. You're in the moment. That's our healthiest place, right? The idea is to train the mind to resist rumination or sort of useless thinking, you might say, and stay focused on the activity at hand, whether that's breathing, whether that's walking, whether it's eating an apple, washing the dishes, etc. The more you can do that, the more you stay in the moment, the healthier you become. Inevitably, of course, the mind will wander unless one is exceptionally advanced at staying present. And your mind begins to drift, right? From being in the moment to all kinds of things that get you out of the moment. Maybe that awkward interaction that occurred yesterday with somebody, or memories of an old friend, or how the car repairs will be financially addressed, or any other countless past or future events, right? When this thinking transpires, the aim should be to quietly bring the mind back into focus while resisting the urge to become frustrated if the spans between mindfulness are short. Because no matter how hard you focus and stay in the moment, your mind's going to wander. You just bring it on back. Bring it back to focus. Back on the music if that's what you're using to focus, right? Or metal in this case, right? The longer one can remain in the present, the less time that is spent nourishing anxious or depressing thoughts that contribute to and often greatly exacerbate mental health issues. So when I'm present in my analysis of Senjutsu and comparing it to other Maiden albums or record reviews or what have you, in that moment, I'm thinking of nothing else, and I'm also at peace, right? That's the beauty of this. Yet even more effective in the practice of using music to enhance mental hygiene is going to another level of awareness and embarking on the process of non-judgmental active listening. So let's look at that side of this for a minute or two here. And again, we'll use the example of Senjutsu. So with non-judgmental active listening, the goal is to essentially let the music speak for itself, free of any type of scrutiny, okay? This is really about being musically immersed while abandoning all other conscious mental activities, okay? Iron Maiden Senjutsu, it's a cornucopia of sounds, and at about 80 minutes in length, it's a feast for any discerning prog metal fan. Due to the complex and or epic nature of most of the songs on Senjutsu and the superior musicianship of each member, one can be present in any number of ways while you're going through Senjutsu. And those include zeroing in on one particular instrument or player. I'm going to be more specific about this in a second, but just following those amazing bass lines, or just listening to the drums, or just focusing on the riffs, guitar riffs, right? These are great ways to stay present when you're listening to Senjutsu or albums like that. Or you might be interested in following the interactions between the musicians. So how's the bass and the drums locked in? How are the guitars playing off each other? That sort of thing. That also keeps you in the moment. Or maybe just taking in the music as a whole, right? Okay. For example, at this stage of active listening, I am no longer judging how good the guitar work is or comparing it to past records. That's what I was doing above, right? In the analytical side of active listening, I was doing those things. Here I'm not. Here I'm trying to stay free of judgment. I'm just immersing myself in the music and focusing on specific aspects, right? So rather than judging how good the guitar work is, for example, I am just intently listening to the three guitar players, Adrian Smith, Dave Murray, and Yannick Gers in this case, all three amazing players, and merely following the guitarists and concentrating on where the guitar lines and the riffs go within each song. Okay, I'm not judging it. I'm just intently listening to where it's going. Given that I personally find metal guitar infinitely interesting, such attentiveness can really heighten my awareness, right? Here's some other examples of non-judgmental active listening. And again, working with Senjutsu or Iron Maiden more generally. Bass lines can be gold for this kind of stuff. Bass lines can be very effective of keeping one in the moment, in part because sometimes a little extra focus is sometimes needed to clearly hear the bass, to hear what's going on. Because after all, with a lot of metal bands anyway, or I guess bands in general, the bass is sometimes more of the background instrument. So it requires you to focus even more to really follow those bass lines. But they're rhythmic, right? So a little care sometimes is needed if you are following the bass lines to achieve mindfulness, to stay in the present, that you don't get too mesmerized by it, because it can be almost hypnotic and then your mind starts to wander, right? But if that happens, pull it back from autopilot back into focus, because it will happen from time to time. Appropriately for mindfulness practice, Iron Maiden's Steve Harris, one of my all-time favorite bass players, is an extremely prominent bass guy whose contributions are integral to any Maiden album, and on Senjutsu, it's no exception. Whether carrying the quieter, moodier passages or raging in full gallop, following Steve's bass work can keep the listener pinned to the present. Never fails for me, right? More generally, if one has the goal of diminishing stress when practicing mindfulness, which is often a goal, right? Diligently listening to bass lines while simultaneously trying to filter out everything else can be especially relaxing, right? When attempting this, I find Iron Maiden's material to be amongst the most calming of any band in the prog metal genre, right? Which some people might find a little bit curious, if not a little bit funny. Because given the bombastic nature of much of Maiden's music, soothing is not often a description you're going to encounter, right? This isn't ambient synthesizer drones. This can be bang, 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 right? For me, though, soothing, right? In the context of trying to enhance mental hygiene by cultivating awareness, it actually fits. I find those Steve's bass lines to be absolutely soothing if I focus on just them and nothing else. Geddy Lee for Rush does it for me every time too, right? So give those bass lines a try when you're trying to stay focused on something and other things aren't working. Just really concentrate on those bass lines and see if that doesn't just calm your mind right down. Okay. Nickel McBrain's percussion, amazing drummer, Iron Maiden drummer, been there for a long time as well. Steve Harris from day one, Nico from album 4. Anyway, he's amazing. Is another excellent outlet. So concentrating on what Nico's doing is another excellent outlet for the practice of non-judgmental active listening. His beats are reasonably complicated. He's pretty, I'm not going to say over busy drummer, but he's got stuff going on. But what I like about him and what's good for mindfulness, his fills are typically non-repeating. He doesn't do the same stuff all the time. So that keeps you active. That keeps you focused. See, what's he going to do next? What's he going to do next time we hit the chorus, right? So as with Steve Harris, nickel provides enough audio stimulation to keep one's attention solely on a particular instrument. So maybe you just want to follow the drums for a couple songs or maybe the whole album. That'll keep you active, keep your mind focused in the present, right? And Nicko is a cool guy to check out in that regard. All right. In heavy metal, the vocals, so unlike bass guitar and even to some degree drums, it's the vocals that typically fight for top spot with the guitars and overall noticeability. Well, I take that back a bit with drums. Sometimes the drums can be pretty up in the mix too, right? But vocals will typically fight with the guitars for sort of top spot and what you're going to notice first in metal, right? Now, of course, we got Bruce Dickinson and Iron Maiden, or at least for the majority of their albums. I mean, what a treat that is. Bruce is a very melodic singer and a master at shoehorning tricky phrases and multi-syllable words into the confines of the music's rhythmic parameters, right? So what am I saying there? Well, what I'm saying is, notice how Bruce, when he takes a line of lyrics, how he can sort of fit that in to sort of the where the music's, how much room he's got in a given sort of part of music, right? Sometimes he's fitting a whole lot of words and syllables into a small space, you know, but he almost always makes it work beautifully. He makes it look effortless, right? That can really keep your mind active when you sort of notice how the heck's he fitting all those lyrics into that small space, right? And then certain times he'll sing higher or lower, emphasize certain words, certain notes, etc. I mean, if you follow that, he's fascinating to listen to. Or where he chooses to rhyme and not to rhyme, kind of thing, right? So all of that can be fascinating, right? For keeping mindful. If you're the type of person who likes to really focus on vocals, which a lot of people naturally do, right? Well, notice how Bruce can make all those words fit within these fairly complex confines of music that Maiden throw at him and say, okay, Bruce, fit these words into this piece of music. I'm not sure how he does it half the time. Anyway, that can be fascinating. Regarding the songs themselves, there's lots of songwriters in Iron Maiden. Certainly Steve Harris has always contributed the lion's share. But Adrian Smith and Bruce Dickinson are certainly important as well. And Yannick Gers and Dave Murray will chip in with songs occasionally. I personally really enjoy observing how the mood of the music supports the theme of the lyric. Maiden is awesome at this. In other words, does the music become more aggressive as the story in the lyrics becomes more dramatic? If you're paying attention, that happens with Maiden a lot. Are the more somber moments accompanied by lyrics that are more downtrodden? Again, in Maiden, you'll see those connections quite often. Certainly, Bruce's voice will typically synchronize the mood of the lyrics with the music. I mean, again, you can see Bruce. You can tell Bruce puts a ton of thought into almost any syllable he's saying, right? You can tell he thinks this through, right? And he links it with the lyrics so well. Yet if one listens closely, it's striking how often the other musicians in Maiden do that as well, how sympathetic they are to the lyrical content. Notice how the bass will seem to, be a little more aggressive when the themes of the lyrics call for it, right? Or the guitar players, the drummers, they all do this remarkably well, right? Appreciating these and other lyric music relations is a great way to stay present when you're listening to Senjutsu, or indeed any piece of work that actually has something to say beyond just say real cliched lyrics, right? Again, that keeps your mind active when you're looking for these lyric music connections, right? Keeps you in the now, keeps you present, keeps you healthy. Okay. It can be also, another thing I can mention, it can be extremely rewarding when discerning how each player locks in with each other. So you can keep your mind active and present by focusing just on one instrument or just the one voice, if you like, or how the instruments are working off of each other can be fantastic as well for your mind. I particularly appreciate hearing how bands with multiple guitars, I mean, Maiden's got 3, right? How they approach a given riff or guitar lick. Sometimes the players largely duplicate the same notes in a riff. Other times, they all have their subtle variations on it, right? So if you got 3 guitar players playing the same riff, do they all do the same thing? Or do they kind of change things up a little bit? Maiden does both, and it's a treat to listen to, right? And you can sometimes see these differences by carefully distinguishing each guitarist's tone and style. That's another cool thing to do in its own right. See if you can pick out what's Dave Murray versus what's Yannick Gers, right? Versus what's Smith. See if you can figure out what guitarist is playing what without looking at the liner notes, and see who's playing the solos, who's playing the riffs, etc., by their tone and style, right? Okay. Bass lines are also extremely interesting in terms of interactions. Does the bass just largely reinforce the guitar riff and just sort of beef up the bottom end? Or do the bass notes run counter to the riff in some ways? I mean, Steve Harris does both all the time. Sometimes he's following the guitarist and just really beefing up that riff. More times than not, though, he's doing something totally different than what the guitarists are doing. I find that endlessly interesting with Iron Maiden. That can keep me amused for the whole album sometimes, just following what Steve Harris is doing in relation to the guitar players. I mean, that just keeps me totally in the moment, right? Or how about, how does the rhythm section intermingle? Again, the other level with Steve Harris is, how is he linking in with the drums, right? I mean, that's fun to listen to with any band. How is the rhythm section working together? I mean, that can be fun for whole albums too. And there are countless combinations of intriguing interactions going on throughout Senjutsu. I mean, I've just named a few, all of which are potentially rewarding for the astute, mindful observer, and lots to come back to time and time and time again. All right. And then finally, I'll mention that with repeated listening sessions, an active mind, somebody who's staying in the present, will begin to decipher the vocal hooks and main riffs more decisively, right? So that you're gonna pick those up as they're coming along. You're gonna anticipate them, actually, right? You'll start to anticipate passages before they arise, especially as you listen to the album more and more. And soon, even the more elaborate sections become clearer, and once elusive instrumentations start to make sense. So the more you hear it, the album just starts to reveal more and more to you, right? And that becomes, for me, that becomes a catalyst to want to keep listening. For me, these progressions constitute a definite sweet spot when I'm trying to decode a new album, so to speak, especially an album that's reasonably complex, which Maiden is, right? It's not only fuel for mindfulness when I do that, when I'm anticipating passages and now starting to unlock more and more of the music. That keeps my mind active, and that's good, right? But it's actually the height of enjoyment for me when I reach a point with an album where I'm still learning. I'm not burned on and I'm not saturated. I'm still learning with every passing, listen, yet I've become comfortable with the music's checkpoints, right? So I'm familiar with it, right? But I'm still learning a lot too. The music is now familiar, but it's far from stale, right? At this juncture, I'm really drawn to play the album. Like I say, it's great for mindfulness, but it's also just pure enjoyment, at least for me. And so with Senjutsu, this occurred, the sweet spot, if you like, where I'm getting comfortable with the album, but I'm still learning tons. This occurred at about the 5th listen for me. And I'm still in that sweet spot even today. So if I were to put on Senjutsu later today, I'd still be at that point where I'm still challenged by this. Wow, I'm learning new stuff, but I'm anticipating a lot too. I'm really comfortable with it at the same time, right? That's the sweet spot for me. So anyway, let's wrap this up. It is often said that while one should learn from past mistakes and plan for the future, right? I'm not saying that there's never a reason to be outside of the present. So we should learn from our past mistakes and we should plan for the future. But most other non-present thoughts have little value, and at worst manifest into perhaps our most useless activity, which I am convinced the worst thing, our most useless activity, is worrying, right? When actively analyzing a piece of music that I find both entertaining and challenging, such as Maiden Senjutsu, I am necessarily present, and I know I'm contributing to a healthy mental health regimen. For me, heavy metal, especially prog metal, at least for me, provides enough challenging complexity, but I'm sure for others, jazz works, classical works, rock, and even some forms of pop will suit the purpose for them as well. Indeed, simpler forms of music can also be a catalyst for mindfulness, as long as there's something stimulating the listener. You have to stay challenged on some level. I think for maximum benefit, one should practice active listening, whether that be the analytical or non-judgmental that I outlined, with pieces that are relatively new, right? It's comparatively more difficult to be challenged by songs that you've heard hundreds, maybe thousands of times. And at the same time, try to keep your mind from wandering, right? That's hard to do if you know it so well. Nevertheless, this can be done. And I will explain how in the next YouTube presentation. Anyway, that's part 2. If you join me for part 3, for those of you who would rather not be challenged by new material, I still think that's the best approach to using metal for mindfulness. But you want to listen to old favorites. I think you still can use an old favorite to listen, to achieve mindfulness, but you have to listen to that old favorite in a different way. And I'm going to use the example of Appetite for Destruction by Guns N' Roses as the case in point. So I hope you will check that out. Have a great, mindful, healthy